Live streaming is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today is August 6, 2021. We want to thank Clinton Ignatoff for helping us. Thank you so much, Clinton. It's always a pleasure. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Amy Gerstler. Amy, is that the right way to pronounce your last name?
Yep.
Oh, boy, I got it right. Thank God. So thank you so much for your time and energy. The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
I don't suppose you want to be a little bit more specific. The best thing? I mean, the best.
Well, that's a good question.
Or action or food group or.
Right. That's a good question. And basically, my questions, you put them into the context you want. So, I'm not really pursuing anything specifically, but I've had people say breathing, and they said pizza, or they said various things like pursuit of a career, or a vocation. So again, just to clarify, it's some of the questions at the beginning are either or too, and it doesn't mean the two choices I give are something that you might say. So it's more the whole thing is like whatever your intuition, your impulse, your guess is.
Okay.
And yeah. So
kind of Rorschach blottish.
It jumps around, but some of the questions are like that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I would say that some of the best things for human beings are excellent health is nice. Love is excellent. Being in touch with animals and the earth and respecting those things is pretty great. And I'm a fan of humility. I also think books are good.
And books. Wow, you really covered the waterfront. I've never had humility. I love that one. So what's your favorite, and we'll get into all those, what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
I like reading, and I like really deep talks with other humans, often one-on-one, but it doesn't have to be one-on-one. And I think those two things are related. I like films a lot, and I really love graphic novels.
Great.
I like hieroglyphics too, but I can't really read them.
I like that word too. Hieroglyphics is important to me. So why do you think humans collect or gather information?
So many reasons. We could probably talk about that and just be listing possibilities for the next couple hours. I think it helps us survive, getting information about what's dangerous and what's not. I think that humans are naturally wired to be curious about the world and each other. I think it gives us a sense of control, maybe a false one. Not sure about that. And I think it can make you feel rich, and you can do things with the information, and you can get a sense of progress, of learning.
That was super.
Quick
and
thoughts.
That was super. And it's sort of, you answered it. The next question is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I think it's pretty innate, because I think sentient beings do that.
Yeah.
They gather information in order to adapt, to survive, to evolve, to function well, to relate to other things and beings and situations. So I think without that, I don't know, you go down pretty fast.
Yep. That was good. Amy, do thoughts create emotions?
I always wished I was like a neurologist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or had done deep studies in those areas, but I haven't, so I can't claim to know what the latest research shows. I think they have a two-way street between thoughts and emotions, and I'm not even sure they're separable in a lot of cases. And some of the writers I feel like I like the best, I think, play with that idea that thoughts, that the membrane, if there is one between thought and emotion, is really permeable.
It's really good, because this again is, you sort of answered it. Your observations of humans, are they more thinking beings or more feeling beings? Now, you sort of answered this in that because we invented the word feeling and thinking, we can separate it. But in essence, we can't separate feeling from thinking. We think we can, but
yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, but just in general, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but just in general, I know it's both and it depends. What's your hunch or impulse to say we're more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I don't think it's separable. I don't think that I think it's sort of like maps. Like if you look at a map, it's like, oh, here's Denmark and here's Sweden and here's, Canada. And it's like none of that stuff is on the landscape.
Yeah.
You expect to see like a big line when you cross from one country to another, but it's the land isn't laid out that way. And I don't think again, I'm not a neurologist. I wish I was. I'm so interested in that stuff, but I don't think, I think part of the glory of humans and part of the problem with humans is that thinking and feeling wash into each other so much. It's really hard to separate them. I think that's one of many reasons why we're having trouble as humans now in some cultures deciding what we think is fact.
Yeah.
And what we think is up for grabs.
Yeah. Well, just one beauty of that is the Latin word factum is the etymology for fact and for fake. And
there you go. It could be more
it basically means to make. So like you're making a fact and you're making a fake. So that was really good. I love you are truly a wordsmith. And I appreciate how you've understood what, there's three basic words. There's spoken word, there's printed word, and there's electronic word. And this is what I've learned.
Thought word.
There is, and there's gesture, and there's variations on.
There's signed word.
Yeah, there's a lot of variations, but it's sort of like through studying Marshall McLuhan, he sort of boiled it down. Well, here's sort of how we can group this to probe it deeper. And one of the women who had a big impact on him, Mary Jane Schultz, invented a word called splitteracy. And she said, as soon as we invented printed word, we split the left and right hemisphere, and she spells it with a $. I would love for you and her to talk sometime. She is amazing. And it's just that whole idea of why do we have to split? Because we invented these two words, so we think we can split things up. So
do you love Marshall McLuhan?
Love? I would say I use your two words. I have problems with him and I glorify him, Okay. No, I think it's been fun studying him for many years. So is thinking more innate or more invented? And again, it's not, I aspire to be a neurologist too, but I'm just saying your impulse, your sort of hunch.
I think thinking is hardwired.
Yeah, it's hardwired. Yeah.
I think we're pattern seeking creatures, we're thinking creatures, we're language creatures. So those are all kind of like modes of thinking to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And can you think without language? Or can you?
Yeah, I think I think tasting can be a kind of thinking. I think smelling can be. I think if you, especially if we are talking about other animals besides humans, I think touch can be a language.
Yeah,
So
that's good. Fill in
color.
the, yeah, that was really good. Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I,
uh, Start writing it down and editing it and moving the thought around on the page.
oh, that's great. McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I've said it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it down. So it really is a fun little thing. That's beautiful because you sort of expanded on Joan. It's not just write it down and edit it and move it around on the page. So Chomsky's another person who says, that we're hardwired for language. He says that language is not just words. Language is culture, tradition, unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. How do you cope when language does not work? It breaks down.
Well, that's kind of a great question. I think then maybe you try, I mean, depends on what the thing is that you're trying to cope with, but
Yeah.
you try to come at it maybe from different angles, maybe some kind of physical engagement, maybe some kind of breathing engagement, maybe let yourself dream about it, maybe meditation. Depends on the thing you're wrestling with, I guess.
Yeah. No, that was good. Breathing, dreaming, and meditation. My friend just taught me yesterday. His guru taught him, or his teacher taught him, see your breath. That's the way to meditate is to see your breath. And you can't really see your breath. So for the last day, I've been trying.
If it's very cold.
That's what, and then, I come from Michigan and I was like, we used to be able to see our breath, but I've been trying it, like just laying in my bed, napping, sort of daydreaming, saying how, and it is a way to focus. But I'll tell you, this was a new question I just started with, and a friend told me last week, how do you cope when language breaks down? He says, I look people I do eye contact. So that was, like you said, you employ some different angle that's physical, because that was good. I appreciate that. So these are two Turing questions from 1950, or one of them. Is thinking a function of the soul?
I hope so.
Yeah.
That would be nice. It would be nice if everything we did was a function of the soul, maybe just like aspiring to the idea that everything you do or say or undertake is a kind of prayer or undertaken in the spirit of prayer, whatever that is.
Yeah. His other question was, can machines think?
Yeah, that's kind of an AI question. I feel like an AI person should answer that, but we certainly offload a lot of our thinking tasks, what we, I think, would conceptualize as thinking tasks onto machines. We certainly have calculators and computers and phones and that we lean harder and harder and harder into to help us do things so that we don't have to calculate, remember, spend time, store information. So depends on your definition of thinking, I guess, but they certainly assist us in our thinking so heavily these days in parts of culture and parts of the world where people can afford them.
Yeah. Do you more pursue meaning or more pursue happiness?
Oh, well, this is sort of like the previous question about thinking and emotion. I mean,
Yeah.
can't they be the same thing?
Look, you're answering a question with a question. Amy, you win. That's what this series is all about, inventing new questions. But it's sort of like, it comes out of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He says, like, meaning lasts and happiness doesn't necessarily last. So like if me and you spend eating an ice cream cone and we're having fun talking, the ice cream cone ends, but the meaning of what we discuss might last. So
But
here's
lots of psychologists say that people tend to be happiest, don't they, when they feel that their lives or their activities or their relationships or their output have meaning.
right.
That's a path to meaning, is a path to happiness, and lack of meaning is a path to despair and feelings of worthlessness.
Yeah. No, again, it's like when humans invent words, we got to deal with how they don't work, because we want them to work all the time. T.S. Eliot said it well. He says, when I talk to you, I got to use words. And I was like, well, we could have done this whole interview with just gestures and notes held up to the Zoom camera. Again, this is sort of a neuroscientist question, but it's just a hunch. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we actually creating it?
Well, I guess I would have to, I mean, a lot of these questions are interesting because they're in that sort of nexus between neurology, psychology, spiritual inquiry, and philosophy. And this question seems to me to kind of be situated there. I really like that writer, Oliver Sacks, and this is one of his favorite questions, I think, among many. And he actually was that rare bird, an incredible neurologist, an incredible writer. I think that consciousness is a function of the brain.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All different kinds of life have all different, quote unquote, brains or nerve systems that, again, it depends on sort of the limits of the term. But I think in humans, it seems to me, and I keep having to say that because I'm not an expert in this field, that consciousness is one of the things that our brains do.
Yeah.
When we're alive. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a verb. And I'm glad you brought up Oliver Sacks. I love him. And cool guy, because he took LSD and he hung out in Venice. Besides, right,
weights on the beach with all those beachers, and he had
right. I mean, definitely a great author. I mean, really amazing books. Super guy. So Audre Lorde says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded and said you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
For dismantling whatever I see as the master's house. I'm not, I think as humans, our situation is sort of dire enough that we need to use every tool we possibly can that works. And if Audre Lorde was right, then we do have to either try and invent new tools or retool the old ones. And if some of the old ones work, I'm always ready to defer to Audre Lorde. She was a complete genius.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm kind of a weird, depressive utopian or something. I believe love is an important tool, and I believe it's not deployed enough. I also actually think, speaking of Audre Lorde, that the tool of how amazing and useful and powerful women can be, and maybe young people too, has not been deployed to its fullest advantage by a long shot. So that's not a new tool. Those are not new kinds of people, women and young people. And people of color too. I mean, one of the awful things about xenophobia and racism and tribalism is that we miss out when we indulge in those things on how useful we all need to be to each other.
Yeah. It's really well put. I appreciate a lot what you said there. George Lakoff, who is a neurologist, says
I didn't know that. I thought I didn't realize he was a neurologist as well as a linguist.
Yeah, he's a little bit of both, and a lot of both. And he says, in order, for the Occupy movement back then to succeed, you have to use the existing tools and invent new tools. You got to do both. Exactly what you said. And it is. You see, you're such a sharp listener. You're listening to the words literally, and I appreciate that, because I asked someone once, what new tool do you suggest? And they go, intuition. And it's like it was a good answer, because they're implying, well, it should be a new tool that we're using, but we've had intuition from day one. So what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Well, I wish I could say that I worried about and thought about the kinds of things that you've been bringing up, the kinds of huge concerns that you've been bringing up in these questions, but actually it's more like I worry about personal things. I worry a lot. Well, or I worry about the personal application of bigger things like mortality, health, the happiness of myself and those I care about, the fate of the world. I do worry about that. And then, very temporal things like particular job things or particular personal crises that I might be going through at the moment. And then, all kinds of weird scenarios. This time before falling asleep, when you're just lying there, I have to say, I'm trying to turn this around, but it is absolutely one of my least favorite moments.
Yeah, I understand. Can you forget to die?
Oh, I don't think anyone is exempt from that recycling that keeps the planet going. I don't like this mortality paradigm, so I'd be very happy if there was some way around it. But to the best of my knowledge, despite a lot of hopeful crackpot theories and things along the way, nobody gets out of it. Everybody has to take the dirt nap eventually.
Great word, dirt nap. I like that. Okay, so McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and receiving like the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we've studied a little in our talk so far is that there's words affect us a certain way, and then they're a little deeper. Sometimes words evoke more than their meaning. So McLuhan said, well, we can look to the artists, poets, writers, filmmakers to reveal these hidden psychic effects of our inventions, but we still ignore these hidden psychic effects. Why do you think humans ignore the hidden and psychic and social effects of our inventions?
Well, if you're talking about language, if you're saying that humans ignore the hidden or subterranean effects of words and language, and that I don't think I actually agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that just the fact that people take such offense at words and at language and at epithets, and that people bother to change their names because they want to change the word that they are known by. And that language is a living, changing thing. I don't think literature and poetry would be meaningful to readers who are not practitioners if people weren't very sensitive and not blind to the denotations and connotations of language and its many levels and its many emotional fragrances and colors. If what you were saying were true, then people who make literature would just be making it for each other and everyone else would just be yawning. But I don't think that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You can also see with little kids when they begin to develop language, how delighted they are by it and how much fun they have with words and how they start inventing jokes, which sometimes don't make much sense they're like, a snail came to the door, ah, but so I think humans are, I think, hardwired for language and very sensitive to it. The same way they're sensitive to music and color. Language does have musical qualities. So I'm not down with the premise there, I don't think.
Yeah, no, that was well put. What's more fundamental, music or language?
Well, they're so linked. I mean, they're both, have a sound aspect. Music has the great advantage of not anyone can listen to if it's music from any culture. You don't need a translator. And that's a huge advantage to, that I can listen to Chinese music or Azerbaijani music or Ethiopian music. And I don't need, ideally any mediator.
Yeah. No, we're going to get into poetry, but what you just said resonates again with T.S. Eliot. He said poetry can communicate before it's understood, that's like music. We could listen to Brazilian music and not know the words, and it communicates a lot to us. It can communicate a lot. But we're going to get into poetry in a sec. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I'm just afraid of bad ideas or violent ideas. I don't, and there's plenty of those. Sadly, they're really bad. I don't like the word evil, but malevolent old ideas. And there's plenty of ones that seem new. Maybe they're always the same horrid ideas, just recycling, cloaked in new language. But
beautiful.
That's what I'm afraid of is destructive ideas.
And this is very helpful because every time I interview someone for the last 35 years, I'm always trying to reword the questions, understand that the question can be moved around and reworded. And that's really a good way to put it. You shifted from new and old to bad ideas. And you also must have ESP because you anticipated upcoming question, but it's coupled down. So the next question is, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Well, I don't know if this is a made up memory or a real memory, but I swear I have a memory of nursing at my mother's breast and biting her. Now, I could have dreamed that, I could have made it up, but it's very persistent. I've always had it, and it's very nonverbal and a physical memory. So it could be true.
Yeah. Well, that's why I learned early on, can you conjure up is how I word it, because a lot of people go, well, I was told my earliest memory,
Yeah.
or I have a photograph or a whole movie. That was good. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Oh, well, having been around people who have lost their memories, I have to say that it's a blessing. I understand, I think, I take mindfully the part of the dilemma that the question poses, which is memories can be so painful and debilitating. And I'm sure there are people who have PTSD who wish they could selectively edit their memories. And maybe all of us wish that. But I think without memory or with damaged memory, that is so ruinous that I would have to say that it's a blessing.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, that maybe that's easy for me to say. I think the memories that I have that could be categorized as traumatic are very few. And that's not the case with everyone's life.
Yeah. Amy, tell me someone in your immediate family who was a role model who had an impact on you, and specifically, what was that impact? Just briefly. And then the second part is outside your immediate family.
When you say immediate family, you mean just parents and siblings?
You can put it in that context. Sometimes people put it in aunts and uncles and grandpa and grandma. So, I mean, whatever you define as immediate family is fine.
Well, I guess then my father. I think I've been pretty male identified in my life, and my father was somebody who loved his work, and I really took that in, that it would be a great thing in life if you could find something in the world that you wanted to do that you absolutely loved, that was engaging, and that you maybe felt was useful. And he was a kind person and pretty quiet. And I think I was really impressed by the weight of his silence. Like, he didn't speak that often, but when he did, it really meant something. I think that's one weird reason why I gravitated toward writing, because I wanted language to mean something, and I wanted to be able to refine it, which talking doesn't really work that way. But if you could just write it down and work on it and make it better and edit it and take that part out and think twice about this, I thought, oh, well, yes, I'm down with that. That's a good way.
It's beautiful. Well put. And so outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact on you or was like a role model, sort of early on, maybe.
Well, when I was 17 and went to college, I met this guy who was attending the college that I came to, whose name is Dennis Cooper, and he completely changed my life. And he's partly responsible, for better or for worse, for me being a writer, because he not only encouraged me and kind of took my cultural education, undertook it in a way as part of our friendship, and was really a mentor to me, but he encouraged my writing, and he exposed me to a lot of amazing things. And he also exposed me to a kind of philosophy or worldview that if you want to be an artist, you have to pursue it wholeheartedly and take in and read and see things. And it was and is a high bar, and it changed the direction I took and how I thought about things and what I wanted to do.
Beautiful. Amy, were you raised a particular religion?
Both my parents were Jewish. We weren't that observant. My mom was always declaring that she was an atheist, but that she wanted us to know what sort of our Jewish background was and what Judaism was, so we could make our own decisions. So, and also she was a singer. She had she studied music and was very interested in vocal stuff. So she sang at synagogue, and that was her big connection, actually, was music more than being a religious Jew. But she made like Passover and Sabbath on Fridays for a while. So I was raised kind of lightly Jewish.
Yeah. Do you pray?
Well, for me, that's a big, interesting question, and it's something I'm very concerned with. I think that, if this doesn't sound pretentious or bizarre, for me, writing poetry is, I want it to be like a mixture of prayer and play. And I'm not sure that thought isn't prayer. I'm also not sure, or talking to yourself or trying to work something out or apologizing, that those aren't forms of prayer. Again, as we were talking to each other, saying to each other earlier, I mean, there's a way in which the idea that everything you do or say could be some kind of prayer or offering, not necessarily to a deity, but because that's a way you want to live. Even as an atheist, just as a humanist, or an aspiring humanist, that appeals to me a lot. That everything would, I loved the idea that, monks and nuns would like point everything in the direction of Christ and of devotion, and of God's love, and even have like their silverware in a cross or something, because every part of life, every breath you take is supposed to be, that kind of dedication is very appealing to me. So it's something I think about. So I don't know if I pray or not, but I think about the concept of it quite a bit.
That's beautiful. Well put. Writing poetry is a mix of prayer and play. Boy, that the first
For
thing.
me, I'm not saying for everyone.
No, I understand, and it's beautiful, because the first thing I'm going to do is, my favorite website is Etymology Online, and I'm going to go and find out where the word pray came from, because it's so interesting how words change and what they, to some people, praying means this or that. So it was good. Now, this is the question.
And it's interesting to do that beautiful practice that you do of getting into the roots of words, and to do it across languages. Like, what are the roots in English? What are the roots in, Russian? What are the roots in Japanese? What is there a word,
Yeah. It's an amazing thing, because, words are,
what are the roots in Spanish? What are
the
roots in
So
Igbo?
you anticipated this question, but you can put it in the other word, but the question is, do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Yeah, these things about what's prayer, do you pray, what's evil, do you believe in the existence of evil? The jury's out for me. I want to say, that with Mark Twain or the 10 other people that this kind of quote has been attributed to, that, nothing that humans do disgusts me, and I believe we're all capable of everything.
Right.
But and then maybe it's more useful to think about what are the different ideas that we've had of evil, and why is that a useful concept? Evil is such a way of othering people, but it's also an acts and institutions, but there's also horribleness. There's horribleness, and it needs to be thought about and addressed. But evil seems like so like it just shuts the door and you can't think about it anymore. It's a way of just writing something off and not saying, well, how are humans capable of this, and what can we do about it, and what went wrong here, and where does forgiveness come in? So there are things that I want to be able to think through or explain to myself or understand that evil seems like, yeah, okay, that was evil. Or it's just, I'm not going to think about this anymore. I'm just going to like blanket it over with a word by pushing this evil button. Okay, it's evil. So it's just relegated to that. It's confusing to me. I don't know. I guess I'm still thinking about it. So
yeah, no, it's good, Amy, because a lot of people struggle with that question, and they basically boil it down to, often, we're all capable of evil. But they usually go, oh, there are people who are psychotic, and then that is the button. If you're psychotic and you do horrible things, then you're evil. So there's
the opposite of the way the judicial system works and the way some of us think. Because if you're psychotic, you actually have, you are suffering from awful neurological problems, and under some, I'm not a lawyer either, or a neurologist or a philosopher, but in some states, that's the criteria by which you're not responsible for your actions.
Yeah.
The idea of evil, it's perplexing.
Well, what I appreciate is that you're not discounting it. You're saying, hey, it's a legitimate thing. Whereas a lot of people with my questions, they want to do what you're not doing. They're saying there is a black and white answer here, and I'm going to give it to you.
Well, people believe in evil and make a lot of decisions based on that belief. I guess I feel like the closest thing to my having an understanding of that, and I'm way far away from it, is that I read this article once that talked about evil as it's pain, and then it's whether you push it in and then people cause themselves harm and they're self-destructive, or they've got problems, or they push it out. And that's what we call evil, because they push it out onto others. But it has all its origins in suffering. And that resonated with me, but I don't know what to do with it in terms of then how you deal with things and people and actions and stuff that exists that you think is evil and needs to be changed.
Well, what you were able to do with it is put it in words and tell me it. So you did good there. But this is sort of the follow-up. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? This one I'm going to set up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the Mob and the Samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how would you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to the Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Well, sadly, Alan Watts is no longer with us, but I'd love to question him and get a little more information about that. Like, what does acknowledgement mean of an enemy? If you tell yourself that they're your enemy, because in a way he seems to be counseling that's so open to interpretation. So forgive me, spirit of Alan Watts. Maybe he means, do you think he might mean, don't label anybody an enemy? And you don't give them that power. You're gonna, whether you set boundaries and real limitations with them, or totally steer clear of them, or yell at them, don't evilize them.
Yeah.
Don't let them be your enemy. Like don't let them make it so easy on themselves. Don't allow that to happen, no matter what. Maybe that's what he means. I don't know.
Yeah, it was great because you, again, you're coming up with new questions to answer questions. That's what this is about, inventing new questions. But Amy, I go back to another cohort of Alan Watts was Ram Dass, and he said back when George Bush was president, he says, "I'm having a real hard time loving George Bush." To go back to your word love, which you said earlier, which I loved, and then a friend of mine was at Ram Dass before he died, and on his altar he had a picture of Trump, and it was like
trying to learn to love him.
Yeah, it's like what does hating him do? But you really, this skateboarding philosopher in Venice taught me this. I asked him these questions about enemy, and he said that the word name is enemy. Like that's words evoke more than their meaning. So as soon as you name someone and say they're your enemy, then you sort of like, that's what I think you interpreted Alan Watts's.
Well, the Alan Watts thing seems to me a little akin to what the I Ching says, which is that hate ties you to the hated object.
Wow.
And the last thing you want when you hate something or dislike it or it's caused you pain is to be tied to it. So you're like, oh, okay. Then I won't do that, or I'll try not to.
That is a good one. Thank you for teaching me that one. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?"
Yeah.
Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism." Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play and watch people act out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, of course, I don't know, but I think I think in the setup of your question, there's an implication maybe that these two things are the same. So why do you need both of them? Why isn't nature enough? And nature and art are very different, and images and the things that images come from are really different. And I think that, and also nature is nature, but what we as humans, I think, are really find wonderful and necessary and illuminating and help us try to find meaning and understanding is narrative or storytelling or combinations of things that make an image or juxtapositions or that helps us rethink and understand or look at things in a new light. So I think we need both, and I revere both, and I don't think they're the same at all. Art is a reaction to, it's not an absolute replication. It never could be. I mean, and the idea that people would say that, well, I don't know. It makes it seem like they think humans are God and that the gods and they can just recreate nature, and we can't.
Right. It was really good. Again, I thank you for listening so closely. And you're like psychoanalyzing the questions. And this is what is most glorious to me in doing these interviews is when people really listen, because it sort of shifts from what Joyce did to what Faulkner did with fiction, saying sometimes fiction is more true than journalism. But what it really evoked in me was either Cézanne or Matisse said, "Oh, if you take your painting and put it in the bushes and it blends in, it's good art." So no, that was really good. So let's just go through your through line a little. I'm sure you've said this before, but what you talked about reading as a favorite form of getting information. Did you grow up a reader because your parents were reading as an example? They were telling you to read, or you picked up reading on your own?
I was very fortunate to grow up in a house that had a lot of books. my parents read to me and my siblings constantly. My dad was a high school principal, so learning, reading, school, those things were giant values. And my mom was very arty. So
yeah,
I was really fortunate. They had tons of books because my mom was musical. There were, this was 10 million years ago when there were records, LPs.
yeah.
My mom had closets full of records of musical comedies and different things, comedy records.
Right.
So yeah, they took us to plays.
Yeah. So then where in your life, what time did you read poetry and go, I want to do that? Like, is there sort of a time where you're reading poetry and not getting it, or you're right away consumed in poetry and you said, where did you come to that point where you says, that's what I want to pursue?
Well, because my parents were so book friendly and book conscious, we had lots of children's books in the house, and some of them were poetry for children. So they were rhymey. I had Edward Lear very early, who I absolutely loved and still love. And he's probably a little responsible for sort of a goofy strain in my work and my weird, goofy sense of humor. So it was partly, I was given poetry that was intended for children very early on. And then I didn't think about it for a while. And my mom, who was so musical, made me take piano lessons, which I was not good at, but she just really kept her hopes up. And I was such a jerk when I was taking piano lessons, and I was a jerk to my piano teacher because I didn't want to do it. And then eventually he was like, well, what are you interested in? And I was like, poetry. And so the next time, he was very smart. The next time I had a piano lesson, he brought me something that I hadn't known existed, which was a poetry anthology. And it had, Edgar Allan Poe and Amy Lowell and stuff that was considered a very kind of narrow band in a way, but it's sort of canon-ish of American poets, Robert Frost. And I was like, wow. And I behaved better at the piano lessons because I was like, this is the guy who gave me this book that I really am amazed by.
It's beautiful. Well, let's get into poetry a little now. A screenwriting teacher told me great film, great art, or great poet is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great film, great art, great poem is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process as a poet?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. I do think this either or thing is a little hard for me, but interesting because I like both. People are trying to define what art is for them, and they're saying, well, it's this, when you can always see this, or when you can never see this. And it's like, I like to feel like I like art that either kind, or one that combines. And sometimes you get a very strong sense of intention, and sometimes you get a strong sense of other things, of music or of mood, or of maybe that all falls under the. I do believe in what the fiction writer Donald Barthelme talked about, writers trying to become comfortable with and able to work from not knowing.
Yeah.
which doesn't mean not having intention, I don't think, but means kind of letting a project have its way with you and letting it have a lot of rope, especially in the early stages. So that makes sense to me, but I think everybody has different ways of working. So
Yeah.
these things where there's one definition, like it's going to be like this or it's going to be like this, there's too many different kinds of minds. I think great ones that make these definitive statements. So I'm just like, well, that's how it is for you, or that's how it is for you, or
well, probably is one of the reasons you're such a successful poet is just that very reason. Because when I ask a question like that, it is begging for someone to take a point of view, and you're being more a comprehensivist and saying it's both, and that's fine. It's also, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. When you're writing a poem, how much are you thinking of your reader?
I think that, okay, I guess my answer to that is I do want people to read and get something from what I write. I don't feel like I'm just doing it for myself, but I feel like, in the best of all possible worlds, I would like to communicate. I would like to have a relationship with readers, or what I write to have a relationship with readers, not me, but what I write. But it feels to me like the best I can do when I'm working is to try and write something that makes sense to my weird brain, and that is I'm writing something that is what I'd want to read, in the sense that I find it interesting in, subject and approach or whatever. And then when I'm editing, I try to read it through a lot of times, being as objective as I can, which for me usually means trying to read it as though I don't know anything about this person, what they've written before, what my little cute intentions were, but just it's got to all be on the page. So to the best of my ability, which I absolutely acknowledge is never perfect, I'm reading it through a bunch of times, like, okay, somebody just walks in and reads this. What do they get? What's confusing? What's interesting? Where's the heat? Blah, blah, blah.
Really well put. And so when you're rereading your own work before you're saying it's, this poem's done, are you reading it out loud or to yourself, or is it a little bit of both?
It's mostly reading it to myself, but almost always towards the end, I read it out loud if I have the privacy to do so and I'm not disturbing people and my dogs are walking in and going, oh, you're doing that again. That's so weird. There's no one in here. Why are you talking, to no one? So I do read it out loud several times, and in the process towards the end. And that's also one of the cool uses of readings. If you're a writer and you get asked to do readings, you can sometimes figure stuff out.
Yeah.
You're in that situation that you're like, oh God, that is not going to stay in.
Yeah. Beautiful. What's the function of poetry?
I think I'm taking function as use, like what's it good for?
Yeah.
Why do we have it? And why does I have read that every culture has it. Every culture has some form of rhyme, and every culture has some form of poetry. Even, cultures that their literature is all oral or mostly. So I've got to believe that, and this is, goes way back in time. Poetry, well, there's that prayer and play thing, like that I mentioned earlier, that I like to think about. It's condensed language. And for me, it's really linked to emotion, emotional intensity. Poems can be so many things. It has a huge link to song. It has a huge link to incantation, to religious thought and speech, to amusement. You know, I mean, poetry is everything from song lyrics to jump rope rhymes to epics to political protest songs to brags to rap to things people like to say at weddings or at funerals or when a baby is born. So these are kind of precious bits of language that are provocative and memorable and condensed, even if they're really long, I think. And I think poetry, it obviously fills a lot of needs that have to do with pleasure and reverence and memory and honoring certain things, exploring things, thought, working things out, memorializing things. If you just look at a list of kinds of poems, odes and elegies and anger poems and walk poems and protest poems, it's huge.
Yeah, it's really well put. And I think it was the great Richard Modiani who gave me your email to invite you to this. And he taught me this one. He said, Gary Snyder said, my task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language, then bringing that seeing into language.
And that makes sense with his work too.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, I've studied the symbolists a little. They had a huge influence on McLuhan and James Joyce, and they came out of Edgar Allan Poe. And this guy, Leo Bersani, said that the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. I was wondering if you have any feelings on that statement.
Could you, that is on the face of it, it almost seems like a very mystifying Zen koan or something.
I know, and I'm glad you actually you're one of these people who really listens, because I've been tackling this and I have my own feelings what I think it means, but I could be way off. It goes like this: the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Yeah, but see, I don't know what crisis or crises he's referring to, A, and B, I mean, if this is a quote that really interests you, have you gone back and tried to find the context?
No, I should. I mean, I'm sure I had.
That might help, you know. I mean, just pulled out of context, it's you seem like you're interested in context.
Oh, I'm interested in context, but it's also like putting it into a new light. Is that I would say it's like when you go to write a poem, that the fact that you're going to write the poem is part of the process of what you're going to write. Or like, where do you get your content for your poems? Because I'm going to write a poem. Or does your hand just start writing a poem and then you go, oh, that could be a poem? So, you know, I know, I think it was your tea time with Tosh Berman, which was brilliant little interview with you and your husband. It's on YouTube. Have you watched this recently? It's great.
No, I've never watched it, but I remember doing it.
Oh, it's really fun. And it's sort of like, oh, no, it wasn't that one. It was the more recent one where one of your students interviewed you for like 90 minutes about digital writing as opposed, and you said, I'm sorry, I mixed them up, that you actually still take notes with a paper and pencil, but you do write on a keyboard now.
I write on a keyboard, and I also sometimes now take notes on my phone in the
right.
thing, if that's what I happen to have with me,
Right.
or it's easier to access that than. And I know writers who get ideas when they're driving on big commutes and who take notes by doing the memo record thing. That it's all
Record.
super
But
useful.
yeah, but it's just sort of like you're going along in your life and you're like, oh, that's a nice little couple words. I want to write those down. And then at some point you go and go, oh, there's my notes. Now I'm going to assemble them into a poem. So I think that's what he's talking about, that the act is so involved in the content. You can't separate the form and the content, in other words. It's again, the whole dilemma, this whole discussion is separating feeling from thinking, form from content, you know.
Well, some people's goal in poetry is that those things feel that they end up feeling inseparable, that they
Right.
end up feeling absolutely one.
Yeah. Well, how about this? You brought up music, and I think it's a big part of both our lives. It's you know, Walter Pater said it so well. All art aspires to the condition of music. Like, you know, literature, painting, films, they all wish they could be as cool as music. But indeed, they all are musical in their own way. And my friend in describing music says there's 3 T's: taste, technique, and theory. So theory is you can study the way poems are made. You know, this kind of rhyme or that kind of rhyme or this kind of structure. That's the theory. The technique is, oh, I can learn this language. I can learn these words, you know, technique and theory. But how does one acquire taste in poetry? If you just took those 3 T's, how did you acquire taste in poetry?
Well, I think taste in anything is you go after what you like, you're attracted to certain things, and that might change at different phases in your life. Hopefully it does. But and you can push yourself to be interested in things. But if you think about taste, which can be a lot of things, as your interests, your obsessions, those things towards which you gravitate, that arouse your curiosity, that pull on you, that engage you, that you can't not notice. I mean, you can stick people in a room and they can all witness the same thing, but they'll all notice and take away and be acted on by different aspects of the experience. So if that's taste, then I think some of it is I think it's probably a mix of nature and nurture where it comes from. That,
Yeah.
you know, you come out with certain sensitivities and proclivities and things that you're naturally attracted to. And then depending on what happens to you and the way the world works on you and the way you choose to think about things, you might gravitate towards other things as well. And it might change like your nutritional needs do. Like there's a certain point in your life where you need to only eat vegetables, and there's a certain part where you think, oh, I really have to get in those dairy products, or you're a person who only likes meat and always has, or a person who eats everything, or you're like me, you're kind of a weird picky eater.
So just along those lines, Oscar Wilde said, all bad poetry springs from genuine feelings. To be natural is to be obvious, and to be obvious is to be inartistic. So just off the top of your head, how do you respond to that? All poetry springs from genuine feeling.
Bad poetry.
Excuse me. I said it wrong. All bad poetry springs from genuine feeling.
Right. I mean, one is kind of a general, kind of vague, humanistic sounding or enabling sounding quote, and the other is pure Oscar Wilde, judgmental.
Yeah.
avowedly snobby, and
Yeah.
so I think that's very Oscar Wilde, is what I
Yeah.
that
Right.
he, and his brilliance and cleverness is that he's having none of that. The way, although there's great genuineness and great emotion, and great passion in what I know of Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
He has those fairy tales, those little tales that are so tragic and heart-wrenching. Anyway, yes, that's Oscar Wilde, and that's what makes him him, and him, the kind of intellectual ornamentation that he has. But there's also poetry that I love that I think would fit under that doesn't maybe necessarily have such a big sense of irony.
Yeah. T.S. Eliot said that poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Well, the super glib answer to that is mostly English. I think everybody's inner dialogue that's what's interesting about writing and speaking, is everybody's my inner dialogue is Amy Nees. I don't know how to make that into the proper noun, and yours would be Gerry's, or I'm trying to think of a different formulation for Gerry.
No, we call it Finneganese, because we read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people.
Okay, there you go. But I think that's the one of the delights of literature, is that, when you read Kafka, you get, even in not in its original language, as I have to do, it's Kafkaesque. It's Kafka.
Yeah.
Speak.
Yeah.
You're getting the language of the better the writer, the more you're getting the language of their brain, or the language of the construction that their brain is making, that it's that work of art. So these feel like unique languages that we can also relate to, and that's why it's so exciting.
Yeah.
You get to walk around in somebody's thoughts.
This great experimental filmmaker in New York, Abigail Childs, I said, "What language is your inner dialogue in?" She goes, "I wish I knew."
Oh, that's a great answer. That's that's beautiful.
That was one of my favorite answers ever. Okay, so speaking of experimental film, Jonas Mika says there is no self-expression. And another icon of experimental film, George Manupelli, says, "Ignore yourself." Cecil Taylor, the great avant-garde jazz pianist, says, "I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me." So I'm just going to get to the real question here, but usually I ask, is art making, poetry writing more self-expression, or more you're a vehicle for whatever culture or technology is dominant? So, it's an either or. So we don't need to really tackle that unless you want to. It's more, can art making, can poetry writing be egoless?
I'm not convinced. This is an open question to me, but I'm not convinced that anything human beings do can be utterly egoless.
Yeah.
I think it can be a really interesting goal. And I think keeping in mind what the ego, what the nefarious ego is up to, and how it's shaping or warping or pushing what you're doing, saying, living, is important. And maybe there are some people who are able to be utterly egoless. I don't think I've ever met one. And I don't think art has to be egoless, because we all have egos, I think, and they're interesting and powerful. And when they're an important element in art, because if art partly is helping us deal with ourselves, to act like we don't have an ego, and to act like we don't have an id, for that matter. That's, I mean, art is packed with id, or most of it is, would not be to make human art.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting goal, and I think interesting things can be done by trying to go in that direction, or trying to go in the absolutely other direction and say, how can I make the most freaking ego-packed, dripping, spurting, ego, soaked, drowned work I possibly can? And what would that be like? I mean, maybe I've even seen some of that work.
Well,
maybe I've done it myself.
Yeah, though, that was well put. Sounds like some of those poets I've heard at Beyond Baroque over the years. But again, you do this spectrum. Pascal, the mathematician philosopher, said, in order to understand anything, you have to understand this end of the spectrum and that, and everything in between. So it's like you have a good sense of this comprehensiveness that I really sort of worship in people. But I asked someone once, can art be egoless? And they go, great, art is egoless. And so what you did was teach me that striving for that is something that could happen, that trying to make art that's egoless,
Oh, I mean, if that's what somebody wants. And there's also, I mean, art that I think doesn't do that at all. That's not its concern, and it's also valuable. It also depends, on what you mean by egoless,
right?
Like, because
it's a huge subject, because usually I follow it. Was Freud right? But we'll just leave that aside. How about this one? Is perception reality?
Boy, this is like a philosophy course, which I have never taken and should have. I feel like I misperceive so many things that I mean, it is your reality of the moment. It's all we have in a way, but I think, literature and art maybe are one way that we can question perception, or try to re-perceive, or try to put perception in different contexts and see how it looks, or kind of examine our perceptions and kind of take them apart and see if we can put them back together differently, or that they'll lead to a different place. So I think in dealing with self and others, it's important for me to remember that, we kind of are our perceptions. And if you want to try to understand yourself or other people or deal with them, got to think about that's their reality. That's what their experience. That's what's happening to them. That's where they are. So our perception is both our reality constantly, but it can also be off. I mean, what are hallucinations? They're, Oliver Sacks, we were talking about him before. He has an incredible book called Hallucinations. That's one of my favorite books. But, you read that and yes, people are really experiencing these things. And yes, this might be why, but others around them are in a different reality. So who's right?
Who's right? Exactly.
I guess everybody's right.
Yeah, there's a degree of that, I believe. And I loved in one of your Zooms I was watching on YouTube, you held your book up to the camera and you said, oh, everything's backwards on Zoom, just like Alice in Wonderland. So it was a perfect lead into Lewis Carroll said, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Well, the great thing about that question is it's hard to know. How do you know if something you believe is impossible or not? Because, I mean, what's the definition of impossible? Something that hasn't happened yet. A lot of things that have happened, I would have thought were impossible.
Yeah.
And also, like we were talking about egolessness and whether that's an interesting or worthy goal, even if it is absolutely unattainable for humans, if it's a good goal because it's a guidepost, believing impossible things might be really helpful in a way. Some people would think that hope is believing impossible things or things that are probably impossible. But
yeah.
So yeah, and then what's the relationship between what you asked and the imagination, which is so important?
Yeah, it entails a lot more. Sun Ra said that the impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world did not change.
He's a smarty pants.
Tell me one major element, Amy, of your poetry in the years you've been doing it, meant several decades, that's changed, and one major element that stayed the same.
I don't know if I'm the best judge of this. I think an element. Okay, well, I think that I've tried to. I don't. These are things that probably don't show, but I think I've tried to pay more attention to music and sound as time has gone on. So that's a change, maybe not an abrupt change, but a sort of quantitative change, maybe.
Yeah.
And something that stayed the same. I think that I want to work on this, but I think that a lot of my deepest, most abiding kind of obsessions, I think like, oh, now I'm in a new territory in terms of like thematic stuff or content or blah blah blah. But I've for I think the whole time I've been writing, I've been interested in dramatic monologues, and I think also there's certain things that I'm just obsessed with, and there are a few things I get obsessed with, like Egyptology and drowning. Those were early obsessions, and snow I'm not so obsessed with anymore, and maybe even Catholicism. But when I don't often look back at my older work, but sometimes I have to because somebody asked me a question about it or something, and I'm surprised that there are some themes that have to do with love and gender and women's lives and being female, or the whole idea of female, male, and what that even is or isn't, that I've been struggling with for a long time. And I thought, maybe I thought I was over that, but I'm not over it at all.
Well, that was good. You really get my questions. I appreciate it, Amy. This has been super fun. Moshe Feldenkrais says that it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Can you tell me a weakness you turned into a strength?
Well, as a writer, see, I don't know if anyone would think this was a strength or not. And this is more probably, this will probably sound more like at best a little piece of self-acceptance rather than turning a weakness into a strength. And maybe that's what it is, just self-acceptance. But when I was a kid, I always thought, oh, I was a kind of a book nerd, and I got bullied a bit at certain times, and I was really, really shy, and I kind of thought of myself and sometimes got told that I was a weirdo, and that was not good. And when I started writing seriously, I kind of went back and forth about, oh, is this a place where I can just really be a weirdo and it's okay? Or should I try to be less weird, both because it's repulsive or just because people won't understand my weirdness? And over time, I actually started to feel that however odd or weird or not my thinking might be, that that was what I had to offer. And that actually I wasn't that weird, in the sense that a lot of people are neurotic in ways that I'm neurotic, or something adjacent to that, and that, or think about sex the way I do, or feel like a Martian, or, you know, you fill in the blank, or are ashamed of X, Y, or Z, or alternately are ashamed of it and boasting about it or something. And that if I had something, I had this friend who was a poet who I really loved, and he once said to me, oh, I don't think a poem's any good unless it's a little bit embarrassing, or a lot embarrassing for the writer. And I was like, whoa. That kind of rocked my world when he said that, because this guy Ed Smith, I thought his work was so great, and I was like, and also the idea that you would have the courage, which he really had, to just like let it out.
Yeah, that is really powerful. That hit me good. That was good. Bravo to Ed.
Yeah, he was really something.
Amazing.
And his work is great. He has a finally his work is available again. It was out of print forever, and there's this nice big book that's called Punk Rock is Cool for the End of the World. That's his poetry and some of his journal stuff, and edited by David Trinidad very lovingly, and it's a terrific book in my view.
Super cool. Well, I asked for 90 minutes. We got about 6 more minutes. Can you go a little more than 6, or you want to wrap it up in 6?
Oh, I'm good. I have I don't have to do anything until this evening. So
okay, so we'll do maybe an extra 10 minutes or so. And Amy, this has been truly enlightening. I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's fun to talk to you. These are very provocative questions in a great way.
Thank you. How do you find peace of mind?
Not very easily is a short. I have grappled with depression all my life, and it runs in my family, and so this is an issue for me. And though I didn't want to accept it for a long time, I swear to God, for me, exercise really helps. It really helps. Long walks. I mean, that sounds so stupid. And for a long time, I would tell my therapists, no, I just sit in a chair and read. That's what I do. You're thinking about someone who's a jock. You know, I'm not going to do that. But it really does help. I love animals, and actually having dogs is, one is just slinked out when I said that.
I saw him. Yeah.
As if on cue. It has been, I am so lucky that they are willing to live with me. They are very grounding and wonderful, and remind you of being on the earth, being just a being, and that's really helpful. Reading, I mean, literature, I feel like has saved my life. Reading and writing are some of the best things in the world. Friends, people who I really care about. Yoga's awesome for me.
I agree.
You know, those kinds of things help.
I agree. Most of those are directly related to my sensibility too. So there's a saying that goes, "You create what you resist," or Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into "You are what you hate." And actually, James Joyce sort of nailed it. He said, "It's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve." And Louis Buñuel said, "Thank God I'm an atheist." So this idea, like you create what you resist. I'm not saying you, but just this idea in your study of human nature. What do you think of that line? One creates what one resists. You create what you resist. Any thought on that?
Well, this might not seem related at all, and it might not be, but for some reason it makes me think about this thing about humans being fascinated by what they fear and
Yeah.
being drawn to it, and why that is, and why we love scary movies so much, and why I mean, I know for me, because I struggle with depression, there's a thing where I find myself constantly going into these terrible scenarios. And I think, well, why do I do that? And it's almost like there's a part of me that thinks that it's protective. Like if I constantly think of the worst, this is not true, but there's some weird thing where it feels like if you, and I know this isn't unique to me by any means, but if you're constantly like running through all the most horrible things that can happen in almost like a making up fictions way, that phew, okay, well, I thought of that already. So somehow you've knocked it out of the possibility of actually occurring, which isn't true. But so it seems to me that that's kind of related to what you're saying.
No,
Maybe not.
it is very related because it helps morph into this other issue I just wanted to bring up briefly. Is it's like violent films. I don't like violent films. I grew up and I saw, Taxi Driver and Bonnie and Clyde and appreciate them as high art. And then it's just like, I don't want to see guns and cutting and blood in films anymore,
Yeah.
But does this, in your thing is we're fascinated with what we fear. Does this watching a violent film alleviate humans of their need to be violent, or does it cause us to be violent? So, we can't answer that. We don't know. It's like the I was like, well, I don't watch violent films. And then I read a history of literature, and it's like the oldest books in the world about people chopping up each other. And, so it's like, well, there's a difference maybe because it's a visual medium and it's a print medium. But the line is more, the question is more, do artists have a moral obligation? Like, do we blame people who are making these like horribly violent films? Or, I mean, not blame them. I mean, I don't want to blame them like it causes violence. But the basic question is, do artists have moral obligations?
Well, again, super big, interesting question. I mean, and it seems like it's a way of asking, what is art for, and what are its missions, and what does it do, and what are the I happen to feel that it's better to talk about things than not. I think that suppressing stuff and pretending that there's not violence or rape or horror in the world, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
So, and I think art can be a real vehicle for enlightenment, awareness, change, catharsis, expression, not feeling alone, not feeling like, oh, this thing that happened to me, I don't have to sit here in silence feeling like I am the accursed and the only one this has happened to, or I can never mention it. So it's a thorny question, but I think the moral if art has a moral obligation, it's to tell its own truth, and then people can, process that.
Yeah.
And we have choices about what art we do and don't consume. You were just talking about choosing at a particular time not to take in certain things.
Yeah, that was good, Amy, because again, it's a question I've just added, like, do artists have moral obligation? And this woman last week said, everybody has a moral obligation, not just not just artists, which is sort of interesting, but I agree with you 100%. The important thing is to talk about the issue and, to bring it up.
And also not to get confused between art and images and real actions in the quote unquote real world.
Yeah.
Like, not to get confused between symbols and the things they symbolize. A flag is not a country, it's a piece of cloth.
Yeah.
A book is a bunch of marks made with ink or something on paper or whatever. Somebody hurting somebody in real life is somebody hurting somebody in real life.
Yeah.
And as humans, we really need to know that we manipulate symbols and images to try and think and understand and represent and do all kinds of things, but to start getting confused. And I admit it's confusing at times.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole issue, separate the art from the artist and all that. It was good what you brought up, but I skipped this question. It sort of fits in perfect here. What do you think, just your hunch, your feelings, was the motive of the cave artist?
Was the motive of what?
Of the cave artist.
Oh, I mean, the same motive that any artist now has, and it probably differs somewhat from individual to individual, but to see and be seen, to make a mark, to leave a mark, to have cause and effect, to have agency, to worship, to honor, to reflect in all senses of the word, to have to take things from the world and experience and one's dreams and one's life, and be able to look at those things in another way and figure out their power and their meaning and their importance or something. To live with it, because the cave, I mean, I think paintings where caves are, to have and to have a relationship with maybe something akin to, dare I say it, I don't know, beauty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a deep
and maybe an incantatory thing, maybe some kind of sort of spell-like power.
Yeah. It's a deep thing because McLuhan loved to say, the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can. And so then do you think, well, these cave artists were like, well, I'm going to go make some art now. It's like they just did it. And it was like, it's sort of like kids drawing art. They're not like going, boy, I hope this ends up on the refrigerator art gallery. My mom loves it. They just make it and it just comes out of them naturally. So it is, it's something you can always think about why humans create art, but you covered a lot there of all the possibilities. And so I just have a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. But this is 5 questions that Alan Watts asked. They're really short, and just off the top of your head and say like a couple words. Who started it all?
I don't know, chemicals,
Good.
a meteor,
That's
gases.
good.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. Are we going to make it?
Hope so.
Where do we put it?
Someplace safe.
Who's cleaning it up?
Hopefully not me.
Is it serious?
What did you say?
Is it serious?
Serious and playful.
Yeah, very good. So, Joseph Boyce said, make the secrets productive. And Lou Welsh, and this was funny that Tosh quoted this very thing. Lou Welsh, the great poet, he was a beat poet and an ad man. He wrote that thing, Raid kills bugs dead. It's like, that's pretty good beat poetry right there, disguised as an ad. Lou Welsh said, guard the secrets, constantly reveal them. But it was Thornton Wilder in 1928. He said that art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. Amy, you laid your cards on the table for the last 90 minutes. I'm really grateful. I'm not insinuating you haven't answered this, but what's it really all about for you?
What's writing all about?
Yeah, again, you put in the context you want. If it's meaning life or writing or whatever. Yeah.
Let's see. I don't know. Love, devotion, trying to muddle through, trying to be as good to each other as we can, trying to learn, curiosity, gratitude, amazement, marveling, the wonder that we feel if we're lucky as children, and not losing that. I don't personally believe in the concept of adults really anyway. I think we're just all different ages of kids.
Yeah. Boy, that was beautiful. What's the healthiest or most impactful cultural shift you see developing today?
I'm not a good public intellectual, or probably even a good intellectual, but I think the idea that countries and cultures have to come to terms with their pasts, that all voices are valid and should be heard, not just in the arts, but in politics, that we're all interdependent, that we're not in these fake ideas of countries, that, if Chernobyl melts down, it's not just a problem for the people who live near Chernobyl. We share a planet, a vulnerable planet, and we're vulnerable beings. And so the idea that some people are trying to come into an awareness that we're all just humans, and racism and tribalism and sexism and all those isms are killing us and horrible, and that we have to start taking the gift of this planet seriously, or else, not just for us, but for a lot of the other creatures and beings that live on it. This sounds very high-handed and whatever, but that's my, the fact that anybody is talking about this and aware of it, maybe it is too late, but I take a little heart from that.
I agree. It was beautiful, as well put. You're really a great person when it comes to putting words together. It's been a delight. The last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
I actually, because I have been lucky enough to teach for like 10,000 years, two things give me optimism, and I'm surprised that at my saying one of them, science. When people across the world, when scientists across the world get together and they're like, we have to develop a vaccine, there's a pandemic. I know there were glitches, I know, and it's not being distributed fairly and blah, 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 but people came up from all over the world. Scientists started sharing information in a way that I think was a little bit unprecedented internationally. That gave me a lot of hope, not just about the pandemic, but just generally for humans being able to work together internationally to solve problems. And then young people, that's why I mentioned teaching. I think young people, the ones that I come into contact with, have been given kind of a raw deal that they've inherited, but they are smart, compassionate, enterprising, inventive, and they surprise me in great ways, and I wish them Godspeed.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice note to end on. I'm optimistic. Just talking to you for the last 90 minutes, Amy, it's really enlightened me. And that is the answer I get from most people. What gives you the most optimism is young people, the youth. So it's really something we can believe in and know that there's this growth towards positivism is possible. In fact, McLuhan said that communication of the new is a miracle, but it's not impossible. So it's been really possible that you were able to spend this time with me and teach me so much. So thanks again, Amy. Really appreciate it.
Amazing questions. My head is kind of spinning. Great to talk to you.
Okay.